Etsy has just came out with some new updated things that we need to be aware of as sellers if you are thinking about anything political, not just these two guys, but anything political. You definitely want to make sure that you're aware of this. So, Chris, with that being said, let's go ahead and pull up the article and then we can kind of dive into the policy updates. So this way here, we can be aware of it. Chris, what's the first thing that we need to be aware of here within this article that was posted by the Value Added Resource?
Yeah, so first, this comes to us thanks to our friends over at Value Added Resource. And one of the things, Scott, that I've noticed that they do really well is they do some comparisons when policy changes happen between what it was before and what it is now. And in a lot of cases, when we see these scary headlines about policy changes, you may remember one that came out a few weeks ago about the change to the abandoned cart coupons and how they said, oh yeah, this just happened. It actually happened like 4 months ago, right? Mm-hmm. They're doing the comparison and they're actually looking at the historical version of the policy to let us know what has changed. And the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway here, and they did make a lot of changes, and it appears that they first showed up on the site on March 5th, which means they are in effect as of the time of recording this. And unless they've changed it again, since this video has come out, they're going to be in effect moving forward. And obviously, the impetus behind doing this in early March of an election year is to make sure that they don't have those issues in September, October, November, and that people have a better understanding as we move, at least in the US, full on into the election season, that everybody's aware of what's happening. So if we look at their prohibited items policy, one of the things that it used to include was a special exemption for political affiliations, right? So the old version of their policy said we want Etsy to be a community where people of all backgrounds, nationalities, religions, political affiliations, and even different types of artistic tastes and humor feel welcome. It now basically eliminates that. So we no longer have anything after religion. So we're just saying political affiliations. That is no longer there. We're still including different types of artistic taste and humor, right? They did keep the line at the bottom the same. And this, I think, is the salvation in the terms of service, at least. How this is determined by somebody who's looking at a political product is different. But they do still have the line that I think here is the most important, which is art is incredibly subjective, and what is offensive to one is not necessarily offensive to other. And if this was the only change that they made, we'd say, okay, you can still post political stuff. You don't really have to even think about this. But as we move further through their prohibited items policy, we see that they changed a lot of other language in here as well that seems to strongly being discouraging towards anything that has a political bent, at least in terms of the hot button issues, right? Education, not really included in this, but anything along the immigration front, anything along those kinds of things, as we move our way through the rest of these changes, it seems to be directly targeted at making sure that Etsy doesn't have anything related to the messaging on either side related to those things. So if we look down at their list of protected classes, the old version of Etsy's protected classes policy said that they don't allow items that promote, support, or glorify hatred towards people. And then they give a bunch of people listed off that they are calling protected groups. In the new version, in place of promote, support, or glorify, they say we don't allow anything that allows violent or degrading language. And to me, this is where we start to run into some of the potential issues for people who are posting political stuff, because we went from a fairly straightforward problem here, right? Promote, support, or glorify hatred. So we're not saying go hate these people. That's a fairly obvious thing. Just saying violent or degrading, which is a much more subjective standard. And so they are then also including, in addition to that full list of people that we had in here before, immigration status, which again, immigration is a big issue in the upcoming US election, right? Or caste. And Scott, if you're not familiar with what a caste is basically a class. And I have a feeling this is brought in specifically because Etsy is onboarding a lot of new shops in India. And this is more of a specifically Indian thing than you would see it elsewhere. Like it's not, you may hear people refer to different classes as castes, but it's not strictly enforced kind of the way it has been traditionally in India. So the US, the way we might interpret this is like wealthy people, right? The upper class, the middle class, the lower class. That's kind of a caste system.
Got it.
It's much more rigid than that. And there's more division than that, but they're including that specifically. And so just based on what you're seeing so far, what are your thoughts on this change in policy? I know you said at the beginning, this is something sellers really need to keep their eyes on. Is this something that if you had a political store or wanted to post some election related things, would this stop you completely just looking at these two changes? Or is it just something that we'd have to be a little bit more careful with language and slogans and some of those kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I wouldn't go down that road, but I'm also not going to choose a side or show a side because I just don't want to be in that arena. So it kind of doesn't affect me. Although some of these things that they're saying does make me feel like they're paying attention, and they're paying attention to what is posted. Just even looking at, some of the language and how they removed it makes me think, well, okay, they're aware of it. They're also doing it to somewhat protect themselves because we are heading into an election year and we know it can get a little crazy. So I think they're also doing that. But also, Chris, and this is where I'd want your, I guess, thoughts or what you've pulled from the article, because you're good at taking something and really distilling it down into, a fifth grade level, which, I can understand. But it seems a little gray to me still. It seems still like, what can I and can't I? Are you saying that I can't post anything Trump or Biden? I just can't do anything? I mean, what if I wanted to just put on there on a mug Trump or put a mug on there Biden? Like, I can't do that. I can't sell a sticker. Like, I guess what is deemed, hateful, or you're discriminating against, one party or the others, or just someone in general. Like, where is the line? So to me, it seems like it gives them the ability to just make that judgment call. It's kind of like balls and strikes in baseball, right? We could call, our strike zone different than the next umpire's strike zone. It's like, it's what I guess, where is the line? Is there a line? I'm asking you now, Chris.
And that's the thing that's kind of interesting in this to me, because if we actually look at the language, to me, it's now less clear and more vague than it was before, right? And I think what they're trying to do is protect themselves against the bad news cycle that will come, because you may remember a few months ago when Trump was arrested in Georgia, and the mugshot came out immediately because it was a publicly available image. It was a public domain image. Hundreds of sellers threw a bunch of Trump mugshot merchandise, Trump mugshot mugs, mugshot t-shirts, right, up on the platform. And all of those fell well within Etsy's terms of service, right? It's a public domain image. In fact, it appears that even some of the campaigns, right, got in on it. But they took a big hit in the news because of that. Because they're like, oh my God, Etsy is allowing people to sell things, right? Regardless of whether you support Trump, whether you hate Trump, like wherever you fall on that spectrum, that was essentially the news cycle. It was like, I can't believe Etsy is letting sellers put up mugshot mugs. It's like, okay, there's nothing inherently biased in that. What they seem to have done here is try to protect themselves against any of the influx that will happen as we get into July, August, September of issue specific things. And I think one of the things that they're trying to avoid is just the appearance of potential left wing or right wing bias on the platform. So I don't think that you're going to run into an issue if you're posting generic slogans, assuming, again, you have the rights to use them, right? Campaign slogans, typically copyrighted, probably not something you want to be posting. But if you want to create a shirt that says vote Biden 2024, vote President 2024, vote Trump 2024, right? You're probably not going to run into any issues there as long as you're not infringing on people's trademarks. Where their focus seems to be is on the issue specific things. So they're saying, let's just stay out of the immigration debate, right? Let's steer clear of that. And so if we're getting into more of that area of politics, that's where it's going to start to become a problem. And I think the other reason that they started to take this approach, and I personally think that it's counterintuitive, is because they actually came up in front of the Supreme Court a few weeks ago. And I know you're aware of this because you and I talked about the story.
Yeah.
But both Florida and Texas passed a law that basically said social media companies, your Facebooks, your Twitters, or X, don't cancel me, Elon. All of those types of places can't discriminate based on political affiliation. And in the arguments in front of the Supreme Court, the states who had these laws specifically said, yeah, that shouldn't include Etsy. Like, that's not a thing. And we see then Etsy specifically takes that out of their terms of service, right? after that happens. And so they may feel like, okay, they put that in because they were worried about it and now they can take it out. But it feels a little weird to me just based on the timing. The fact that it just happened in the news cycle, right? And now they're like, yeah, don't worry too much about political affiliation. We'll just take that out. We don't have to think about that. And so even though political affiliation isn't a protected class specifically, they're eliminating some of the issues there, if that makes sense. So
yeah,
you can still post politically affiliated things. They just want to stay away from any of the real like hot button specific topics. And they did remove some of the protections that you would have had to argue to say, this is my political affiliation. You can't discriminate against me for it. That is now gone from the terms of service.
But in that, it did say political affiliation. Now, what does that mean? So it's like they're saying that we don't want that, but yet from the way that you're reading it, then you can do it. It just can't be hateful or it can't be discriminative. You know what I mean?
That I think is the important change here, right? The previous version left political affiliation as a protected class, meaning if they took down your political thing, you could say, hey, this is my political affiliation. And they would go, oh, okay, right. Just like this is my nationality, right? It's a Puerto Rican pride t-shirt. What's wrong with you? You know, it's a Colombian pride t-shirt. What's wrong with you? You'd say it's a Republican pride t-shirt or a Democrat pride t-shirt, right? Now you don't have that as a defense as a seller. It's no longer something that they are protecting explicitly. Okay. And so it is leaving political sellers much more open to the whim of whoever is interpreting it. And to your point, by making that language more generic, they are opening it up much more for interpretation versus saying, well, that, you know, it doesn't glorify violence. They're not saying go attack people at the border. They're just saying maybe it's a problem. Now, even that becomes subject because of the change they made to that language, which now basically just says violent or degrading. So what, obviously violent is still the same, but what is degrading? My definition of degrading might not be the same as your definition of degrading. And that's the entire reason there's hundreds of thousands of pages of Supreme Court decisions on First Amendment law and all of these kinds of things in the US, right? And so what they've done is basically removed that as a protection. They've opened this up. And if you are selling political things, it's something you're going to want to be very, very careful of. And Scott, I think the other thing I wanted to point out here, and this is something we fall victim to a lot, and it's a term that's thrown at us quite frequently, is they made a change to some of their specific things around groups. And previously, things like hate groups, right? However you define that, whichever political leaning you have on that. Obviously, we can all probably agree Nazi party, not a good thing. Right. And so that's the example that they use. And they previously allowed you to use things like grammar Nazi, right? We get yelled at all the time for our grammar. It's niche, not niche, right? Both are acceptable in English, by the way. So for all of you grammar Nazis out there, you're actually wrong, right? Go look at the dictionary. But this is something that I see a lot of people have, right? They make some sort of a joke or a pun related to one of these groups. That is no longer allowed, right? So basically they removed some of the specific exemptions that were also in this policy that allowed you to use that. The one thing they did leave in place, and you have to kind of read through the entire terms of service to see this, is like they acknowledge that a swastika is not necessarily a Nazi symbol. It was used by the Nazis, but it's also a historically Hindu symbol, right? There's a bunch of religious connotation to it. And so that is still a defense. They just don't want you actually saying Nazi in any form. And that's what leads me to the conclusion, Scott, that what this is really about is just trying to take a step back from any of the hot button issues to just be like, yeah, just don't say Nazi in any connotation on the platform. And then we don't even have to think about it. Right. They're just trying to wipe their hands of any potential implications.
So then let's do this for sellers out there that are thinking to themselves, you know, maybe you were going to go down the road of possibly selling something political or something, again, that is selecting a group. Chris, why don't you wrap it up by giving some last little bits of advice on how to be careful if you are going to go down that road? So this way here, we can kind of go by the rules, but also allow ourselves the best chance of not getting in trouble. What would you recommend for that?
Yeah, the real answer to this question is if you're trying to sell anything political, you can go historical, you can go generic political, right? Go whoever 2024, you can probably do those kinds of things and be safe. What you're going to want to avoid based on this terms of service change is any aggressive slogan right? Anything that is a hot button issue. So steer clear of immigration, steer clear of abortion, steer clear of education, steer clear of any of those kinds of really hot button, third rail political type issues. And you should be okay here. You can get into some of those things, right? And it's not explicitly disallowed on the platform. And they left enough wiggle room in the language that you will probably be able to get away with it, at least until somebody reports it. And then it's totally up to the discretion of Etsy. So if it's my store, I'm probably going to avoid a lot of those things. Does that mean we won't get to sell quite as much in the political realm? Probably, right? But if we want to be safe, we want to protect the long-term implications of the store. We want to avoid any of those hot button third rail issues. That appears to be the real impetus behind the change that Etsy's making.